On the evening of March 29th, 1871, a little after 9 o'clock, when the lanes of Turville had sunk into blue-gray shadow and chimney smoke hung low in the air, a thin light still glowed in the Sadler cottage at the edge of the Hambledon Valley. The Chiltern Hills rose around the village like the curved hands of something ancient, their beech woods bare and skeletal at the end of a long English winter. Wind slid down the slopes in narrow streams, moving through hedgerows and rattling at loose panes. Turville itself was small and self-contained, a church tower, a few scattered cottages, a lane that turned muddy in rain and dusty in summer, fields marked by stone and thorn. Inside the cottage, the day's work had fallen quiet. Boots rested by the hearth, damp from the fields. The air smelled of wood smoke, boiled potatoes, wool hung to dry. Children settled in corners, the familiar weight of weariness pressing them toward sleep. On the narrow bed against the wall lay 14-year-old Ellen Sadler, the youngest daughter, her body shrunken by months of illness. Only 3 years earlier, she had been sent out as a nursemaid to Marlow, another child hired away to keep the family afloat. There, weariness had come over her, not like ordinary tiredness, but in heavy, sliding waves. Seizures followed, spasms that twisted her limbs and left her spent. A hospital had studied her for 18 weeks and then given her back with a word her family heard as a sentence: incurable. Now she was home, in the valley that had raised her, but the valley could not reach her. As the clock in the church tower marked the slow passing of 9, another seizure shuddered through her. Muscles clenched, jaw tightened, fingers curled against the sheet. Then, as suddenly as a storm that spins itself, the convulsions eased. Her body rolled gently onto its left side. One hand slid under her cheek. Her knees drew up just enough to suggest comfort. Her breathing settled into a shallow, barely audible pattern. That was all. No cry, no final protest. Only a surrender so complete it looked like rest. Around her, the noises of the cottage thinned. A chair scraped softly. Embers shifted. A whispered prayer may have crossed someone's lips, shaped more by fear than by hope. Outside, the March wind moved on, brushing past the walls of the little house, as if it had discovered nothing unusual inside. But in that hour, something in Ellen stepped away from the world. She did not answer when her name was spoken. She did not move when her shoulder was gently shaken. Her eyelids did not flutter at lamplight, at the closeness of faces, at the uneasy movements of her brothers and sisters nearby. To all appearances, she had simply fallen asleep. Midnight came and went. Dawn, pale and reluctant, found her unchanged. Her mother watched the thin rise and fall of her ribs with a kind of stunned attention, waiting for the moment when the girl would stir, complain weakly of pain, ask for water, ask for anything at all. The moment did not come. Day melted into evening, evening into another night. Outside, the fields waited to be turned, the hedges to be clipped, the daily work to begin again. Inside, time seemed to hesitate, as if the cottage had been nudged a little sideways from the ordinary flow. That night in March would later be named as the beginning. People would point to it as the hour when the youngest Sadler daughter lay down to rest and did not return to the waking world for 9 long years. For now, it was simply a strange, silent night in a valley that did not yet know it was holding its breath. On a chilly morning in early April 1871, just after 7 o'clock, when the distant fields were marked by thin frost and smoke rose in pale threads from cottage chimneys, Ellen still lay on her side, in the exact position she had taken that first night. The doctor from Stokenchurch, Henry Hayman, arrived with the habitual calm of a man used to broken bones and fevers. He examined the girl with careful hands. Her skin was warm. Her pulse was quick but regular. Her chest rose and fell so lightly that he had to watch closely to be sure. When he called her name, there was no answer. When he lifted an eyelid, the eyeball slid slowly away, not with fear or recognition, but with the slow, drifting motion of something left to itself. He could not wake her. Days arranged themselves around the bed. The Sadler children came and went from their work, glancing at their sister as they passed. Sometimes they paused just long enough to see if the blankets had shifted, if an arm had moved, if anything at all had changed. Nothing had. Weeks folded into months. Spring softened the fields. Lambs appeared on the slopes. In the lane, carts bumped by with sacks of grain, and boys with bare feet chased one another, skirting puddles. The valley's life went on, but inside the cottage, one narrow bed held a fixed figure that seemed to belong more to stillness than to any season outside. Feeding her became its own ritual of patience. At first, her jaw opened with a sluggish effort, enough to admit spoonfuls of milk or weak broth. Then, one day, the muscles locked. Her teeth would no longer part. She lay with her lips pressed lightly together, breath seeping out between them in the faintest of sighs. Her mother solved the problem with a strange tenderness. Tiny toy teapots appeared beside the bed, little china things meant for play. She filled them with milk or port wine or thin gruel, tilting each one so that the narrow spout rested just beyond Ellen's teeth. A few drops at a time were eased into the slight gap, trickling down into a throat that did not swallow consciously, but somehow accepted the offering. The sight of those delicate vessels, lined up as if for a child's afternoon game, made the scene more haunting. Here was a girl who could not play, surrounded by toys that had become tools of survival. Summer came. Flies droned at the window. In the evenings, light lingered longer on the hills. Visitors began to arrive. At first, neighbors, then distant relatives, then curious souls from nearby villages. They stepped into the dim room, eyes adjusting, following the hush that always seemed to gather around the bed. They saw the same picture. The girl on her left side, hand under cheek, knees slightly bent, hair smoothed back by the endless repetitions of a mother's hand. Her cheeks were thinner now, her limbs more fragile, but there was a softness to her face that looked like sleep rather than the rigid stillness of death. People spoke in lowered voices about what they had seen at the well, in the churchyard, at the hedgerows. They described the faint breath, the warmth of her skin, the quiet certainty that she was alive and unreachable at the same time. Year turned toward year. Frost returned to the hedges. Snow brushed the sloping roofs, and once more the valley pulled its shoulders against the cold. Ellen's position did not change. The body, which in ordinary life is a restless, shifting thing, had become a monument. Time worked itself out on everyone else's faces and bodies. On hers, it seemed to move more slowly, touching her only enough to make her thinner, paler, lighter, as if she were being gently erased but not removed. In the hush before sleep, her family measured their days by the small reassurance of her breathing. She was not living as others did, but she had not gone. She occupied a narrow space between presence and absence, drawing the household into that same narrow space with her. Outside, the valley turned from season to season. Inside, a single long night continued, stretched thin over years that refused to wake. On a bright summer afternoon, In 1875, shortly before 3 o'clock, when the sun laid pale gold across the Chiltern slopes, and dust lifted from the village lane in soft little ghosts, the Sadler cottage stood with its door slightly ajar, and strangers were already on their way. By then, the story of the sleeping girl had traveled far beyond Turville. Newspapers in nearby towns had carried the tale. A child who had fallen asleep and remained so for years. A doctor baffled. A mother devoutly tending her bedside. Printed words had a way of turning private suffering into public curiosity. Carriages arrived that did not belong to villagers. Men in better coats and heavier boots stepped down, smoothing their sleeves. Women leaned forward, their faces a blend of concern and morbid fascination. They had read about the girl. Now they wanted to see her with their own eyes. They entered the cottage in small groups, bringing with them a smell of leather, cold air, ink, and distant places. Coins passed from their hands into the household, sometimes openly, sometimes with a muttered apology, sometimes with polite insistence that the family must accept something for their trouble. In the low room, the visitors quieted. It was difficult not to. Ellen lay where she always lay, body curled in that same side-on posture, lips closed, hair smoothed, eyelids resting without flutter. Her chest rose and fell faintly, as though each breath was a decision that her body was making with effort. Doctors from outside the village examined her with professional suspicion. They lifted her hand. It remained slack and yielded easily. They pressed a finger against her skin. It was warm, not slack like that of the dead. A few crueler skeptics used hidden pins, pricking at flesh to force a reaction that did not come. Her mother watched them all, hovering close, eyes shadowed by long years. She had learned to read the difference between those who came out of genuine concern and those who treated her child as an exhibit. Yet she allowed the examinations to continue. The family needed the coins and the story. Once it had escaped the cottage walls, could not be called back. Whispers of fraud began to weave themselves into the tale. In Wales, another girl, Sarah Jacob, had recently died after being publicly displayed as a fasting girl, said to live without food. Her parents had been tried and convicted. The newspapers had raged. With that memory still fresh, some visitors to Turville arrived already suspicious, primed to see deception. They questioned whether Ellen was ever sat up in secret to feed. Some claimed to have seen a faint movement at her window by night, a suggestion that she was not as insensible as claimed. Others darkly suggested that she was being drugged to maintain the illusion, kept in a chemical twilight while coins flowed into the household. Yet no one ever caught her awake. Dr. Heyman, steady and quietly stubborn, continued to insist he could find no sign of trickery. He had examined her over and over across the years, and always she was the same, breathing, warm, unresponsive. He saw poverty, devotion, exhaustion. He did not see a conclusive lie. Inside the cottage, the tiny toy teapots remained lined up, their spouts stained with repeated use. A few drops of milk, a trickle of wine, the thinnest gruel. These offerings continued, adjusted to the narrow opening between the girl's teeth, sustaining a life that seemed to float somewhere just above the reach of consciousness. Outside, the cottage gained a new name on the lips of visitors: Sleepy Cottage. It became a point on the map of rural curiosities, a place where people might stop on their way to somewhere else, to peer for a moment into the face of a mystery, and then retreat to the safety of their ordinary days. For the family, it was not an attraction. It was their whole existence shifted off its axis. They lived with the knowledge that their misfortune now also sustained them. Every coin placed on the table was both a kindness and a reminder of how deeply Ellen's condition had sunk its roots into their lives. Each stranger's footstep on the threshold was a fresh stirring of doubt and hope, of shame and necessity. The world's gaze turned on the bed in the corner, on the girl who would not wake, and left behind in the quiet after visitors departed. On a damp May morning in 1880, near 11 o'clock, when low clouds pressed close over Turville and the church bell's slower toll carried through the valley, the Sadler cottage was quieter than usual. The bed by the wall still held the familiar shape of Ellen's body, curled on its left side, hand tucked beneath her cheek. Her breathing continued, soft, stubborn, almost diffident. But another presence in the house had gone. Her mother, Anne, whose life had been bound hour by hour to the care of the sleeping girl, had died. The The strain of 9 years had gathered inside her like a secret weight. Heart trouble, the doctor said. A swelling of the organ that had beat too fast for too long against worry, exhaustion, and the ceaseless demands of poverty. Her death drew officials into the cottage, not just to consider the cause of her passing, but to ask a harder question. What was to be done now with the daughter who did not wake? An inquest was held at the Bull and Butcher, the village public house. Papers rustled, ink stained fingers. Names were recorded in looping hands. Voices debated whether the remaining family, Anne's husband and the other children, could properly care for Ellen. The case, once only a curiosity, had become a matter of duty and responsibility. Reports of the inquest carried cool language. Girl in a chronic state, lying in one position. No signs of fraud conclusively found. Beneath those phrases lay years of quiet desperation, unrecorded. The many nights Anne had sat half asleep in a chair by the bed. The way her hands had grown rough from both field work and washing linen. The small, fierce refusals to let anyone remove her daughter to some distant institution. Now that refusal could no longer hold. The authorities decided that Ellen would be cared for by her married sisters, Elizabeth and Grace, who lived nearby in Turville. The bed moved. The walls around her changed. The air in the new room had a different pattern of light and shadow. But the girl herself remained in her long curve of sleep, as if the world could rearrange itself indefinitely around her, without reaching whatever layer of reality she inhabited. For those who watched over her, the vigil took on a different shade. Without Anne's intense, possessive focus, there was space for other feelings to surface. Weariness, perhaps, that did not have to hide behind a mother's fierce devotion. Siblings, now older, with their own families starting, still had to pause and pour the drops of milk, still had to listen for the faint whisper of breath at night. In the village, whispers changed tone. Some said that without the mother's presence, there would finally be clarity. Either the girl would be moved to a hospital where London doctors could unravel the case, or time itself would bring resolution. Others simply waited, feeling that they had already spent their curiosity and were left only with an odd, lingering pity. The valley, of course, kept moving. Children who had been born the year Ellen fell asleep were 9 years old now, running along the same paths she had once taken, unaware of what it felt like to climb the slopes after rain, or to stand in the doorway at dusk, watching the fields darken. Ellen's body had grown older in the most limited sense. Bones lengthened slightly, features refined, but she had skipped the visible clumsiness of adolescence, the awkward angles, the shifting expressions that come with new awareness. Her face bore only the slow, smoothed marks of time spent in one expression, a kind of peaceful blankness. In the evenings, when lamps were lit and the day's labor was set aside, those who had known her before the illness sometimes sat and remembered the sound of her voice, the clatter of her steps on the floor, the way she had looked when fully awake and present. They confronted the strange reality that a living body could carry the name and shape of a person, while the person herself remained unreachable. 9 years is long enough for a story to harden into something almost like legend. Yet within the walls of the houses that held her, it was never only that. It was the constant work of care, the subtle reshaping of every plan and every day around someone who demanded everything without ever asking. With Anne gone, the empty chair by the bed became its own quiet symbol, a place where a mother had worn grooves into the floor with the small movements of her feet, a place that now stood vacant, as if listening for someone who would not return. And while the valley absorbed one more death into its long memory, the girl at the center of the story lay still, suspended between the past and a future that had not yet decided what. On an autumn morning in November 1880, around 8 o'clock, when mist clung low in the Hambledon Valley and the fields were blurred into soft shapes, something changed in the quiet room where Ellen lay. It was not dramatic. No cry pierced the air. No sudden cinematic movement broke the stillness. Instead, small signs appeared, so small that they might have been missed had the watchers around her not been trained by 9 years of silence to notice any deviation. A hand that had lain slack for nearly a decade twitched. Fingers flexed just once, as if remembering the idea of grasping. A slight shift passed through the curve of her body, a murmur in the muscles that had long been resigned to one unbroken posture. Her eyelids, so long closed, lifted. Light, thin and gray through the window, entered eyes that had not looked back at the world since she was 14. Accounts would later say that she recalled nothing of the years between. No long dream, no passage through strange internal landscapes. Consciousness, for her, seemed to leap from the worsening illness of 1871 to this cool November morning, as if everything in between had been erased. Her voice, when it emerged, was hesitant, the sound of a child that now belonged to a grown woman's years. Her legs, unused for so long, trembled under the weight of her own body as she was helped cautiously to sit up, then to stand. The first steps were uncertain, like someone learning to walk again after an injury. Yet beneath the weakness lay a stubborn will that had carried her through 9 hidden years of breath and heartbeat. By the end of that month, reports spoke of full recovery. She moved about the house. She ate like others ate. Her growth had been stunted. One eye remained weaker than the other. But she was no longer the still figure that had occupied the center of so many arguments and so much quiet grief. The world that greeted her was not the one she had left. Siblings were older. Some were married. Children in the village who had never known her awake now saw her passing their doors. The doctor who had first examined her in 1871 had carried the weight of her case for almost a decade. Neighbors who had speculated endlessly about fraud or miracle now saw her walking in the lane, a living contradiction to their most confident theories. The visitors were gone. Newspapers had found new marvels and tragedies to report. The cottage, once full of soft-footed strangers, returned to the ordinary business of a working family. Sleepy Cottage remained as a name, but its central spectacle had quietly packed itself away. In 1886, in nearby Folly, Ellen married a man named Mark Blackall. Together they moved from the valley to other towns, Barkham, Caversham, where census records would list them matter-of-factly: husband, wife, children. No mention of the 9 years. No note that the woman of the house had once been a fixed point in an international curiosity. She raised sons and daughters, measured her days not by the slow drip of drops from toy teapots, but by the small routines of family life. Meals prepared, clothes mended, tempers soothed, laughter in quarrels, and the tiring sweetness of ordinary responsibility. Historians and physicians would return to her case long after her own life had moved quietly on. They would fit new language to the old puzzle: narcolepsy, catalepsy, psychological collapse, possible poisoning, conscious fraud. None of these labels, however carefully argued, could reconstruct those 9 years from the outside. For Ellen herself, those years remained largely absent. Her story, as she carried it, was not a continuous line through every day she had ever lived, but a thread with a long, unseen knot tied somewhere in the middle. And so the mystery persists, gently haunting. In the soft hush of a late night telling, with the sound of rain on windows in a low crackle like distant embers. The story of the girl who slept for years becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a meditation on the fragile distance between waking and not waking, on the ways a family's devotion can bind itself to a single bed, on how poverty and wonder and suspicion can all coexist around one small, breathing body. Turville still sits in its valley, the hills rising quietly around it, the church tower watching the fields. People pass by the cottage, once nicknamed Sleepy, rarely thinking of the girl who turned it into a legend. Yet somewhere in its walls, perhaps in the slight unevenness of a floorboard, or the way light gathers in a corner at dusk, there lingers the faintest echo of that long, strange pause in a young life, a pause that no one could fully explain, a pause from which, one misty morning, the story itself finally stood up, stepped out of the dark, and walked on.
Ooh.